Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Head to Head. And tonight I've got a guest who is going to, I think, open a few people's eyes. There's an untold story, I think, or certainly an unpublicised story in the battle for Brexit. Many of us who were going out beating the drum out and about outside of Parliament were perhaps getting headlines, not always that favourable, but getting headlines. But there were people within Parliament who were working in the patriotic interest for the independence of our country. And I'm very, very pleased tonight to be joined by one of the key movers in that. And I'd like to say, first and foremost, welcome to the show, David Nuttall. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Bill.
Thank you. And this is a kind of a follow-on show, really, because we had a few weeks ago Simon Richards of the Freedom Association on the show, and he was very much singing your praises because we did a kind of potted history of how we got to our independence, and your name featured quite broadly. So I think for those who are watching, because there are people from all around the world who tend to look at these streams, perhaps you can give us a little bit of a background as to how you started into politics and where it was, and fill us in with a background.
Yeah, certainly, Bill. Well, look, my background was from South Yorkshire. I grew up in a mining community on the edge of Rotherham, about 5 miles from Rotherham, about 7 or 8 miles from Sheffield. And my dad worked in the steelworks in Sheffield, which there were two big industries in South Yorkshire. People will know there was mining and steelwork. And Dad worked very much on the shop floor in the steelworks in Sheffield, and my mum was a housewife, and I had one brother. We lived in a little terraced house in the village, and it was basically a working class background. And I went to the local comprehensive school in the village, and I first developed an interest in politics when I did a politics A level. It was the first time that the school had offered politics as a choice, and at A level, and I thought, well, I'll give it a go. I was interested in current affairs at the time, and I thought, well, it was something which we all start equal. But my problem was I didn't very good at anything in particular, and I thought, well, with politics not being offered before, everybody will start equal. It was not something we'd done at O level, but it was an option at A level, and so there were only 5 in the class, and I was the only one, needless to say, who ever sort of ventured down the conservative right-wing path. Funnily enough, many years later, you may have been watching the stream, my politics tutor and I met up when I was in Parliament. Amazing coincidence, absolutely astonishing coincidence, which is a story for another day, but he'd followed my progress. After I left school, I didn't do the conventional thing and go to university, and I didn't go down the mines or follow my dad into the steelworks, which incidentally by that stage were closing in the 80s, and Dad was made redundant and did a variety of other jobs after that. But I actually wrote a letter to ask if I could join the local Conservatives in Rotherham, and I don't think they had many of these. They didn't have many people applying to join for some reason. And it was an interesting start in my political career. And I remember those days fondly. We used to meet as the Rotherham Young Conservatives. And we met in the Rotherham Conservative Club on a Thursday evening. And that's how I first got my interest in practical politics, having studied it at O level and A level.
And I'm guessing it was quite a small group, the Rotherham Young Conservatives. It was perhaps not filling the whole club.
It's not a bad guess, that, Bill. It's not a bad guess. It was a fairly select group um, and we did have, of course, one superstar, and he will be well known to everyone, as he went on to become a future leader of the party, one William Hague. Because I eventually became chairman of the Rotherham Young Conservatives, and the previous but one chairman was William. And so William used to join our meetings when he was back from Oxford, and he was very much one of the crowd. You know, he was part of our little group, and we obviously admired what he'd done and followed his career with interest. And obviously, years later, I finished up sitting on the green benches with him, albeit he was in a far more elevated position than I was, of course. Yeah, so I learned right from the bottom the day-to-day politics, knocking on doors at election time, and as soon as I was 21, which that was the limit at that time, I was able to stand for election to the council, and I stood in a local ward, and I carried on standing for council, and eventually there was one ward in Rotherham which was able to occasionally elect Conservative councillors. And I was delighted it was 1990, and I stood there, and I thought, this is my big chance to be elected. And it was what was known later on as poll tax year.
Yeah.
1990. And there were 5 polling stations in the ward. And most of them, 4 of them were quite good for us. And one of them was quite a strong Labour area. And I'll always remember going to look round the polling stations in the evening, and they were literally queued around the block to vote, which is, as people will know, is a fairly unusual thing in local elections.
Extremely
and I thought
so.
to myself, if they're queuing around the block in the Labour polling station, this isn't going to go well for me. And it didn't go well, and I lost by quite a number. Fortunately, the local party decided to give me another crack a couple of years later, and I was elected onto Rotherham Council, which was the first time I was ever elected onto anybody. And at the time, there were 66 councillors on Rotherham Council, and one of them, prior to me, was a Conservative. And when I was elected, it made it 2 Conservatives and 64 Labour.
That sounds a very lonely experience. Just as you go on further, though, I'm intrigued by a couple of things you've said. I mean, first of all, that thing about seeing the people queuing at the polling booths in the Labour areas being a bad sign, and I do remember on the several occasions I've stood for council looking at certain polling areas and thinking, I do hope there's a good episode of Coronation Street on tonight or something, or it rains or something, because if those polling,
I watch Corrie.
but if they come out in numbers, you've got a problem. But I'm intrigued as well. You mentioned William Hague. Did he join in the sort of local activity, you know, the knocking of the doors, or was he more of a sort of a cheerleader and a supporter, but didn't get into the nitty gritty? I should use that term, should I? The everyday politics.
He wasn't around. I mean, he was in at the time. Rother Valley constituency was one large constituency, and it was split into 2. Rother Valley and Wentworth. It's now called Wentworth and Dearne. But Rother Valley was the large area around Rotherham, and Rotherham was the bit in the middle that was always on it. It had a constituency of its own, and of course it still does. And so I don't recall him being active in my part of the Rother Valley, but of course he was away at Oxford and then moved on to a job, but he came back, of course, and stood in his first election which I think would have been 80, either 83 or 87. I'm not certain, to be perfectly honest, which of those two elections it was. But he stood it in as the local candidate before he went on to fight Richmond, which was he won in a by-election when Liam Britton became, I think he became a European Commissioner, and that created the Richmond by-election. But he was certainly very supportive, and always has been. And you know, his family lived in Wentworth locally, and were very supportive. In fact, I'm not sure if they didn't live in Greensboro or Wentworth, but that area anyway.
So you went from that to one of two on this socialist dominated council. That sounds like it was great
fun. It was an interesting existence in the sense that I remember the first meeting, because they got such a huge majority. It was very much like a Soviet operation. The council meetings were over in a flash. All the work was done behind closed doors, and the public meeting was just a rubber stamp exercise. And I always remember at the very first meeting, we managed to extend it despite their vast numbers and the ability to shut down debate. The meeting started at 2:00, I remember, I think it was Wednesday afternoon, and we managed to extend the meeting so that it lasted until 7 minutes past 2. and they were horrified that the meeting had gone on so long.
Well, it's hardly filibustering, is it? That must have taken some big effort to get the 7 minutes of the meeting in. But I think a lot of us
they had the numbers to crush any sort of talking. You know, the mayor just moved next business, and that was it. But
a lot of us watching will be familiar with the way Labour dominated councils work, and it's a common pain.
To proceed after that. We did develop a little bit after that, but it was an interesting time. And I first stood for Parliament in 1997 in Sheffield Hillsborough, which was after I left school. I joined a firm of solicitors as a trainee legal executive, and I studied for a law degree by correspondence college, and studied in the evenings, at weekends, and eventually through London University as an external student. And I obtained a law degree and went on to do my Law Society finals and qualified as a solicitor, and subsequently became a partner in the firm, and the firm was based in Sheffield. And so my activities were around South Yorkshire. I went on to become area chairman of South Yorkshire Conservatives after William Hague changed the structure of the party when he became leader. So I stood in Sheffield Hillsborough in 1997 as a local candidate. And then in 1999 was my first involvement with the European politics, because by this time Tony Blair had become Prime Minister, and the 1999 European elections, again, if people recall, were the first time that the elections had ever been held on a proportional representation basis. Prior to that, they'd always been on the traditional first past the post system. And I was one of the 7 candidates on the slate of candidates for Yorkshire and the Humber. And I was put down, not surprisingly, given my inexperience, perhaps at number 6 on the list. But nevertheless, the 7 of us covered the whole of 56 constituencies, covering the whole of Yorkshire and the northern part of what was called the Humber, 4 parts of Lincolnshire. Huge area. And we spent most of our time, certainly I did, travelling around day after day after day after day in the campaign. A lot of the time talking about the some of it on the merits of the European Union, but a lot of it, to be honest, was about the merits of proportional representation and how on earth the D'Hondt system of electing members of the European Parliament would operate. I've always been someone who opposed proportional representation, and I always use this as one of my arguments, that I was always told that if you had proportional representation, people would flock out and vote in their droves because every vote would matter. But I have to say that in 1999, the fact of the matter was that most people were so confused by it that they just stayed at home. And it did not result in any huge increase in the turnout.
Well, I can testify that the parties were confused by it as well, because when I was elected under that system in 2014, we didn't know that I was elected until about 3 o'clock in the morning, I think it was. And even though all the votes were in, Labour was celebrating, thinking they'd got it. I was at number 3. Labour was celebrating. And then someone came over to me and said, "Oh, actually, it's you," because I was just about to leave the building, covering my head up in embarrassment, having lost. So yeah, the people voting don't know, and certainly the parties don't know either.
No, it's a bizarre system. I strongly oppose it, and but it did give me the opportunity. Our number one candidate at that time on the list in Yorkshire was the leader of the delegation of our group. And there was Timothy Kirkhope was number 2, and number 3 was Robert Goodwill, because Robert's still a member of Parliament, and for Scarborough and Whitby. And I got to go. I think it's probably the only time I've ever had a freebie trip in my life in politics. We got all the candidates were invited to go over to Brussels to see the European Parliament as part of the process, and I suppose around this time I was beginning to crystallize my views about the European Union, and I went on to stand in having stood in Sheffield Hillsbury in 97, I was selected to fight Morecambe and Lonsdale, which had always been a Conservative seat up until the Labour landslide of 97. Whenever we didn't know when it would be in those days, or when the next election would be. It turned out it was in 2001. That was the what might be called the foot and mouth election, because there'd been an outbreak of foot and mouth, and the election was held in June, if I remember rightly, and it was greatly affected. Campaigning was affected by especially in rural areas, which much of Morecambe and Lonsdale was. And of course, the leader was my old friend William Hague, and we campaigned under one of our main campaign slogans was "Keeping the Pound," which I had no difficulty in supporting. And but the reality was that Blair was still very, very popular, and the votes didn't really move very much at all, and I wasn't elected.
Mission impossible that year, I think, for most Conservatives. I think when Blair was at the peak of his powers there, I think it's no dishonour not to have won in that one. I think it's fair to say it was a tough one.
If I remember rightly, the number of Conservative MPs hardly moved up at all. In 2001, I think we probably gained 1 or 2 seats back, but that was it. And I was subsequently selected to fight Bury North, and which in 2005, and lost the first time. I was reselected, and then I was elected as the Member of Parliament for Bury North in 2010, and of course, as everybody will know, it was not an outright result in Parliament. There was a coalition government formed between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, and with David Cameron as the Prime Minister. And I very soon became, I'd made it clear right from the outset that I was someone of Eurosceptic views. And it's interesting that someone of Eurosceptic views has meant different things at different times. When one looks back at the memoirs of well-known Eurosceptics from the previous parliaments, simply wanting to stop the drift towards a ever more centralised Europe was put somebody in the category of being a Eurosceptic.
Yeah.
What we did was to take it one step further. We argued that not only should we stop the drift, but we should actually leave the European Union. And this was a completely different, a step change in what was being put forward. My former colleague on the Green Benches, Philip Davis, had first of all put this forward, and it was regarded as being completely off the page, that this was not party policy. And he established, in association with the Freedom Association, who you mentioned earlier, the Better Off Out group in Parliament. And I'd made it clear privately to those for example, the members in UKIP, that the UKIP party, that I would, if I was elected, be taking a better off out view of the world. And as it was, they stood against me anyway. Whether or not that would have made any difference, it doesn't matter particularly, because I was elected in 2010. But the fact of the matter was that at that time there were no UKIP MPs, and there were therefore within Parliament it needed a voice for those who thought that we would be better off out. And it wasn't something that was widely discussed. In fact, I think it's fair to say it was hardly ever discussed in the media. It was something that was so far removed from day-to-day politics that it was simply not regarded as likely, possible, sensible, something that was ever going to happen within our lifetimes.
And how did your Conservative colleagues react to that stance? Because I remember at the time, but having been briefly a member of the Conservatives around that time, there was quite a lot of pressure applied on some people, and quite some unpleasant conversations we had with whips and senior officials within the Tory party. What was the reaction from the hierarchy and from your MP colleagues?
Well, I think obviously some people were very supportive, because some people shared my view, and there were a small group of us who were, if you might want to call the hardcore, or some people call ultra right wing. I don't know why. I always used to point out that in the lobbies were people like Dennis Skinner and Jeremy Corbyn and others. It wasn't purely a right-wing cause. And I used to, argue that, look, this is about sovereignty. It's nothing to do with right or left. It's about, do you believe in our country having the right to rule itself, to govern itself? And we'll come on to the merits in a moment, perhaps. But going back to views of others, I mean, I think the leadership regarded us, first of all, as just a nuisance, frankly. That's my opinion. I think that we were looked upon as being a nuisance, that if they ignored us, we'd probably go away. and I was young. I'd only just joined the Commons, and no trouble would come from my quarter. They thought they'll easily keep me in the box, and I made it clear from the outset that I wasn't going to seek ministerial preferment. I wasn't interested in being sent on foreign trips to far-flung sunny parts of the world. That didn't interest me. What I was interested in was standing up first and foremost for those who'd elected me in Bury North, and for fighting for the causes which I believed in, which I have to say very often didn't coincide with what was a coalition programme of government. And I always used to make the argument in that parliament that no one who had voted for me had voted for this strange concoction of policies which we were being asked to put forward. That had never been on the table, and the people who voted for me had never expected to be presented with them by a Conservative led government.
On that note, what would you have done? Because I remember around that time having a conversation with Lord Tebbit, where he took a similar point of view to yourself, that the policies of a coalition government weren't the policies the Conservatives had been elected on. And his view was that they should have put through a budget or a proposal for government in short time and said, right, try and get it through Parliament. When it was blocked by the other parties, go back to the country for another election. Would you have been of that view, or did you think that there had to be a coalition of some sort?
I can't, to be absolutely honest, say I'd given it much thought, because once those couple of weeks had passed, which I was sort of in a blur, setting up my office and just trying to cope with life as a newly elected MP, I think, to be honest, I would have much preferred a new, straighter election, a straight election and a straight outcome with a Conservative victory. But that, I would say that, wouldn't I? I can see why David Cameron did what he did. I can understand him wanting to grab power, and it suited his vision to be able to operate from a relatively centrist point of view. But I'm not sure that's necessarily where the country is or was. It's a bit like, in a way, Tony Blair trying to triangulate and develop a third way. If people remember that, this idea of it's either this way, that way, or you're better off in the middle. I sometimes think, well, the problem with that is you finish up upsetting everybody. My view was that we'd not had a Conservative government since before 1997, and the time was to start. We should have been starting to unravel the mess that Labour had made, and some of the things were very good, to be honest. We did start to sort out the public finances, and credit is due for that. But certainly on the European question, I was concerned that it wasn't being given the attention that it actually warranted. And the reason was, in my view, was that there was a cosy consensus between the main parties that it was unwritten, probably unspoken about, but the consensus went along the lines of, look, we all know what's going on here. We don't really want to have all this discussed in public. We don't really want people to start discussing about the fact that we're drifting towards a European superstate. So we'll just talk about everything else. We'll quietly let this all happen in the background. And, one day, somewhere down the line, it will all become so obvious and so impossible to get out of that we we won't need to debate it. It will all have happened, and the United Kingdom will become part of this giant European Union. I used to make the point and often say that one of the reasons why I was so opposed to the European Union was that people said, "Oh, look, it's not a European superstate at all. It's simply a trading bloc. It's simply a friendly association of like-minded states." But I used to point out, look, you've got a single currency now. You've got a parliament. You've got your own flag. You have your own presidents. In fact, you've got variety of presidents. You don't have to be Einstein to work out where this is all going. It's going in one direction only, and that is to have a centralized government in Brussels governing all aspects of everyone's life right across Europe. And it was pretty obvious to me that it will never work. I still believe that, but I mean, good luck to them. I've got no objections to those countries who want to stay in it. If they can make it work, that's fine. But I think there's a fundamental problem with it. And the fundamental problem is that there isn't a common history or shared background of the European Union. It's an artificial construct. It's an artificial amalgam of states being pushed together by politicians who don't really understand the grassroots across Europe. And by that, what I mean is that in our country, for example, within the United Kingdom, if, for example, there's a problem in the northeast and an industry in the northeast needs help, then by and large, people throughout the rest of the country will say, yeah, fine, some of our taxes can go and help the industry that's struggling up in the northeast or down in Devon or Northern Ireland or wherever it might be. I'm not sure. In fact, I'm pretty sure. I say I'm not sure. I am sure. I'm pretty sure that if, for example, we were part of a single government, a single unified European Union, and they said to us, "Look, we're going to be using part of your taxes to bail out these Portuguese olive growers," I don't think the people in Bury North would be very happy about that. They'd be saying, "Well, hang on a minute, what have we got to do with that?" And I used to point out to people that this was going on right now.
Absolutely.
It was going on right now. It wasn't something I was making up. We were paying billions of pounds every year for the privilege of buying goods from them. How does that work? I mean, in what other walk of life would you say you go into a shop and say, "I'd like to buy some of your goods, please. Oh, and I'd like to give you some money before I do so." And the shopkeeper said, "Oh, you can't buy any goods. You need to pay me some money first."
It's a good ruse if you can crack it, isn't it?
That's essentially what was happening. It's just crazy. And there were all sorts of common sense reasons why, and I've been disappointed over the last couple of years of the way the negotiations have gone. I think they were badly handled to start with, in terms of the way that I think we were very weak to start with, to be perfectly honest. I think we should have started from a position of saying, right, better off out as one. These are our terms, like it or lump it. And I think, they were the ones who were selling more goods to us than we were buying from them. And I think the fact that we didn't go down that road led to a whole host of problems.
Well, I think that's probably due to the fact that the Prime Minister at the time didn't believe in it. I mean, you will have had some dealings with Mrs. May and those around her. It occurred to me at the time, because I remember going into the European Parliament and they were terrified after the referendum, terrified. They thought, oh, this is it. They'll come out of all guns blazing and going to demand X, Y, and Z. And they were really concerned. And then they saw Mrs. May and the position she took, and the fact that Parliament was basically conspiring against Brexit, it appeared as well, and they believe they've got a lot of good friends in Parliament who are helping them in the European Union, and they hardened their position based on how weak our position was. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that and why that was.
Well, as I say, I think that they started off on the wrong foot. I think that the whole basis of the negotiations was weak, and they should have taken a much stronger line over the merits that we had, and said, look, we will negotiate around cooperation on things like security and so on and so forth. But it soon got muddied with things like the Northern Irish question, for example, where I've never understood why, nobody seemed to ever ask the question that the European Union said they didn't want a hard border in Northern Ireland. We said we didn't want a hard border in Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland didn't want obviously a hard border in Northern Ireland. So everybody was saying the same thing, and yet for some reason they managed to turn it into this giant negotiating platform. I just thought to myself, well, this is crazy. And of course, as we've seen, it was only the European Union who want to weaponize the Northern Irish situation, and that's just one example of a whole host of matters where I think we've just been very, initially certainly, it was very badly handled, and I think that things improved when Boris Johnson took over, and I think he started to really say, look, I've got this mandate, and really he knew that after the general election it was time to sort matters out, and thankfully he has done. I don't know if we want to cover, Bill, we've sort of jumped over perhaps a big lump of the story before we got to Brexit.
I wanted to bring you back actually, because you're being rather modest, because there are things that you did before this that I think people need to hear about, and they are unique achievements of yours. So let's take a step back.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we developed that because I was saying where my Euroscepticism came from. But at the time, if we just roll back a few minutes, David Cameron was wanting to talk about everything else other than Europe, and said so as much in terms, really, that he wanted the party to stop banging on about Europe. So this was in around the time of the conference in 2011 when I was a member of Parliament. And so at that time, there'd been, due to a change in the way that Parliament operated, a backbench business committee had been formed, which had the power to allocate time in the main chamber for debates. And backbench MPs could go to this committee and put forward a case to be given some of this time. Any MP, didn't have to be from the governing party, you could be an opposition MP, but you had to be able to explain why you thought that it was a subject worthy of debate. This seems ridiculous. I mean, this sounds like out of a fairy story now in view of what's happened, but in those days, it was so far off the agenda that this is what you had to do. And so I went along and I put together a case to say that I thought it was about time we discussed having a debate on having a referendum to leave the European Union. And this was regarded as something that was completely, as I say, off the wall. But the committee chairman at the time was Natasha Engel, who went on to become, of course, a deputy speaker of the House. And I was very fortunate that at the time, people like Philip Davis and Peter Bone and Philip Hollowbone were on the Backbench Business Committee.
Yeah.
So I was able to persuade them, not the first time, I have to admit, but eventually I got enough support and put together a strong enough case to be given a whole day's debate on the subject of a motion that we had to have drafted, approved by the Table Office, of having a debate on whether or not we should leave the European Union. And of course, it's all set out there in Hansard. But what happened was quite interesting in that ordinarily these debates were held at the end of the week on a Thursday, which was basically the last day of the normal week, apart from Fridays, which were always for private members' business. So it was the last day of the normal week, and lots of MPs would often, it would be backbench business, and if they weren't interested, they'd often go back to the constituencies. However, I expected my debate to be on a Thursday, and it was only at the very last minute, I think probably the Friday before, that we were told it was being brought forward to the Monday. Because they wanted to have the Prime Minister was there, the Foreign Secretary was there, who was William Hague at the time, to be able to effectively marshal the troops. And there was a 3-line whip imposed by the Conservative Party against my motion. And similarly, I believe, in the Labour Party, and of course the Liberal Democrats had no doubts about opposing it. And this wasn't, of course, to actually leave the. This was simply to have a referendum about leaving. You know, this was to say, well, let's ask the people. They didn't even want to ask the people. They thought you knew better than the people.
They were frightened what the answer was going to be.
Yeah, and so I remember the end of my opening, as I opened the debate and made the opening speech, and I had to deal with loads of interventions, as you can imagine, and it was I'll be honest, it was a fairly tense time for me, you know, as a young MP. You know, that the House was packed. I was putting forward this bombshell of a motion, and all bar a few people were dead against it, you know. And I finished off by saying, look, we might lose this battle, but we won't lose the war.
How right you were.
Yeah.
And the importance of getting this into Parliament, this discussion in Parliament as well, is something that needs to be emphasised, because all of the sound and fury outside of Parliament about the EU, it counts for nothing if you can't get into the chamber of power and have it actually discussed. So to have made that first inroad was a precedent. It was in many ways a turning point. Yeah.
Well, we went on from that, and you know, it was a clean affair. You know, it wasn't just me. There was Philip Davis, there was Peter Bone, there was obviously Mark Reckless and Douglas Carswell. There were a number of people who were of a better off outlook, and there were voices on the Labour Party as well. You know, let's not forget that. Austin Mitchell at the time, obviously Dennis Skinner, and there were voices on the opposition benches. Not many, I admit, but there were some, and you know, they were perhaps not natural bedfellows. But the point is, I always stood up for them to the extent that I said, look, they tended to be, if you like, the people associated with the hard left, as you might say. But I always said, look, if you can persuade the British people of the strength of your argument and you can get a hard left government elected, well, good on you, and we'll have to live with the consequences. I think we saw when Jeremy Corbyn became leader and tried to do something, the result of that. So I'm not afraid of having a straight right-left argument with the British people. Bring it on any day. And we've seen the results. So I was not bothered, really, not afraid to have these as rather strange bedfellows in this particular debate. And I'd always understood, I'd always known that, first of all, we had to have a referendum. People aren't used to say to me, oh, well, look, you could do it if, I agree, you could have done it if UKIP had secured enough seats in Parliament. But from my point of view, that just didn't seem to be likely. I know, Bill, your background, and I have to say, with the greatest respect, Bill, and a lot of my, a lot of friends of mine were in UKIP. And of course, Mark Eccles and Douglas Carswell decided ultimately to defect to UKIP. I was always at one point, I was the bookies' favourite odds on to join UKIP, as they opened a book as to who will be the next MP to join UKIP, and of course I was the favourite. But I argued that as long as the Conservative Party allowed me to speak up for what I believed in and to make my arguments, then I would stay and fight for leaving the European Union within the Conservative Party. I knew I wasn't alone. I knew there were lots of other people in the party who agreed with me, but I also knew that the Conservative Party couldn't do it alone. We had to unite with the people who'd left the party in UKIP, and there was no point in being rude or derogatory about those people who'd left the party. It was always the case that if you're running a shop and somebody goes and starts shopping at another shop, you don't hurl abuse at them. You ask them, well, why is it you're going to shop at somewhere else? Let's look at what we're selling, or our products right. What is it?
A policy not followed by the rest of the Conservative Party, I must say. Though I remember we used to get some worse abuse off the Conservatives than we did off Labour, which I found extraordinary. But look, you were proved right, because having you spoke of my background. I tried twice to get to Westminster. 2015 and 2017, and 2015 the opinion poll suggested I would get there, and I didn't. So you although it sounds to me like you're the kind of guy who would have fitted in great with us, because we're all you're of a similar kind of background to me in almost every way, from what I've heard tonight. You're right to hold your position within the Conservative Party and hold that seat. Your history has vindicated your choice. So it's another situation where it's really interesting that if you hadn't taken that choice, who knows? And all the other Conservative MPs who were Eurosceptic had decided to jump ship. Who knows where we'd have got to? We needed you guys on the inside.
So, but I also thought that not only did we need to unite the right in the terms of the Conservatives and UKIP, but we also needed votes from the left. We would never do it just on if you like, say, right of centre votes. We needed to win over the left, what I might call left wing votes, because as we saw, what happened was we're getting into the detailed results of the referendum now, but the vote within the Conservative Party wasn't it wasn't total. There was a large chunk of the Conservative Party, which were Conservative supporters in the country who supported our remaining in the European Union. And this was evidence in the results. It wasn't it wasn't won in sort of the leafy parts of Surrey. Really, it was in more surprising places that the referendum was won. So I always knew that we had to build a coalition. I'll be honest and say that right to the end, I never ever thought we'd do it. I suppose I'm somebody who always hopes for the best but expects the worst sort of thing. Then I'm not disappointed. And when you think that you've got the main broadcaster, the BBC, who were meant to be impartial, but I think most of us would think that they were, by and large, tended to give a fair run to the pro-Remain side. You've got the government machine, which was obviously very, very pro-Remaining. Big business, by and large, one or two exceptions, but mostly big business was all in favour of Remaining. You've got most of the unions in favour of Remaining. It was a difficult, tricky situation, and you've got the leader of the Conservative Party, the governing party, telling people that this is important. David Cameron, I'm talking about, standing there and saying, "Look, I'm the leader of the Conservative Party. I'm going to vote to Remain." And obviously, this goes right back to the vote that we had in 2011. I sort of skipped over the result of that vote, but the result was that even though there was a 3-line whip, 81 Conservatives rebelled against the 3-line whip. And what happened then was that although obviously the motion was lost by hundreds and hundreds because all the other parties they were all in the against lobby, we then formed an all-party group on holding a referendum. There was already a group called Better Off Out, which coordinated activities within Parliament, and I took over the chairmanship of that from Philip Davis. And we used to meet regularly with groups from outside Parliament, also with the UKIP peers, with people like Malcolm Pearson, the former leader who was in the Lords, and Norman Tebbit often used to attend our meetings. Sometimes we'd get Labour people like Austin Mitchell sometimes came along, and we used to coordinate our activities and decide, look, let's ask questions at certain departments, question time, and we basically kept up the pressure of making sure that the whole issue of leaving the European Union, rather than just trying to stop the tide, but actually pointing out that this was something that we actually had to leave the organisation, was kept on the agenda and kept being talked about, basically keeping the flame alive and keeping it going. And of course, eventually, that led to David Cameron making a speech that where he pledged that there would be if there was a Conservative government re-elected in 2015, then there would be a referendum held. And I think it's probably common knowledge that lots of people think that he probably thought that that wouldn't happen because there'd be another coalition and he'd be able to jettison the idea and say that, oh well, the Liberals won't wear it, well, we can't have the referendum. But when we were returned with a small majority, it meant that we were actually being whipped to vote for a referendum. Of course, this was an interesting position for me, and I used to always say that it's funny how things happen in politics. You know, a few years earlier, there was a 3-line whip against the idea of having a referendum, and then in the next parliament, there was a 3-line whip in favour of voting for a referendum all of a sudden.
It must have given you great satisfaction.
Well, it did really, and of course, having been an out-and-out rebel, I suddenly became a government loyalist, which was a bit of an unusual position for me to be in. But you know, I was wholeheartedly behind the policy of having this this bill, and it was an interesting situation, I have to say, and but you know, ultimately we were proved right because of the strength of the arguments. You know, that's what really mattered. You know, it was the strength of the arguments, and I think that, you know, we can see it so much these days that I think that there is a big danger in politics that you know, that the Westminster bubble are out of touch with what the everyday man in the street is really thinking about. There is far too much emphasis, in my opinion, these days on political correctness, on talking about matters of identity. You know, what are we doing for this group? What are we doing for that group? Is this group getting the same as that group? Should this person be regarded as A or B? It's all lost on the general public, I can assure you. It's of great interest to the middle class, you know, in Islington and reading The Guardian, but for most people, they just shake their head in disbelief and say, look, what we're interested in is having efficient, well-run government services that provide us with what we need, but by and large we want government to keep out of our way. We want to keep more of our money for ourselves. We don't want it taking off us in taxes. We want to keep more of our own money and spend it in the way that we want to do, but we accept that we've got to pay taxes for basic public services, but we don't want to pay for a phalanx of left-wing advisors on all sorts of strange policy areas, which frankly, if you ask the public, they just wouldn't vote for them. But because they're swept away inside all other things, people just often don't even know that these advisors are there doing all sorts of strange things. But you know, I do think that this is a big problem, and I think it was demonstrated at the last general election by the Conservatives winning. And perhaps if we just mention that in Rother Valley, where I grew up, is now represented by a Conservative Member of Parliament, and I'm proud to say that I'm now president of the. I was re-elected as president only last week of the Rotherham Conservatives. And for me to be president of the Rotherham Conservatives and have a Conservative Member of Parliament in Rother Valley is I find quite amazing, really, when I think that back in the day we struggled to even field candidates.
Yeah, I think it's amazing the way things have changed, but I think a lot of it is down to the exactly what you said in your last sort of few minutes of conversation there, where you're talking about the real issues that people care about, and rather than this left-wing identity politics. That was why the large areas of the working class, Midlands and North, went to the Conservatives, and I can only hope, and unfortunately, because we're running out of time, it might be a conversation we can have another day. But I could only hope the Conservatives actually take your approach towards dealing with it, rather than being perhaps a little bit too chummy with that side of things. But because we're coming towards the end of our hour, I do like to give the last couple of minutes to my guests to say, the final words, and to say, what you're up to now, what's your passion about now, and as you stand right now. So if you, last couple of minutes, if you can bring us up to speed with your life right now.
Absolutely. As we sort of skipped over the fact that I lost my seat in the 2017 general election.
I did that on purpose.
When 33 of us lost under that general election under Theresa May's premiership. And so I've had to go on and find one or two other things to do, which I have. I sadly lost my wife a couple of years ago in 2019, but I'm now involved in a range of different activities, and I'm extremely busy. And I'm one of the things is that, apart from being president of the Rotherham Conservatives, I'm also the very busy chairman of the Bury Conservatives, where I'm pleased to say now again have a Conservative MP in Bury North and a Conservative MP in Bury South. So I'm looking after the two associations which operate together as a federation, a loose association, a federation, and we've got elections in May, so we're busy putting together our manifesto, and there's still a Labour council in Bury, so we're working on trying to replace that with a Conservative council. So that's my main occupation at the moment, my main preoccupation, I should say. And I'm also involved in blue collar conservatism, which obviously along the lines of what I've been discussing, trying to encourage the Conservative Party to keep closely in touch with the what might be called the working class vote, and make sure that we remember that there are votes to be held in all parts of the country, and we need to build on the success of the last general election.
Well, excellent. And all I can say is I wish you good luck with all of those endeavours. It certainly sounds like you're keeping yourself busy, which is good to hear. It's been too short a time, really. I've enjoyed the conversation very, very much. I just want to say before we wrap up, so from myself and from everyone else who wanted our independence, we may have been in different parties, but we were on the same side, and I want to thank you
Absolutely.
for what you did.
You.
It's a great patriotic service to our country. It genuinely is, and it's something that I'm sure you'll carry with pride forever, and you should, because what you did was remarkable. So thank you, David. We've overrun our time slightly, but I'm sure that everyone watching will forgive us for that, because it's been such an interesting conversation.
Thank you very much.
I want to say thank you to David Nuttall. I want to say to everyone, if you've enjoyed it, share it on the social media platforms. Put it around. Don't let people stop us getting our voice out. Share this. Subscribe to Open Dialogus on YouTube and share it around as much as you can. But for now, from myself and David and Head to Head, it's thank you and a very good night.
Good night. Thank you very much.